I am delighted to be joined by Dan Glazer, Managing Partner for Wilson Sonsini in London. Dan, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
On my quest to try and unearth this journey of how we get UK startups to go to the US, it did seem that all roads pointed to you. It doesn't matter who I spoke to. Everybody encouraged me to speak to Dan Glazer. So you were this mythical figure who I was adamant that I should seek out to try and kind of get advice on this topic, which is obviously, it is quite a complicated topic. But just to sort of set the scene, how did you end up in your current role at Wilson Sonsini?
Yeah, I think when I think back on it, I remember a meeting I had with the UK government in New York. I think it was about early 2010 or so at the consulate in New York, and end up getting introduced by mutual contact, and they were telling me about this thing called the Tech City Initiative, and they told me all about how Cameron had sort of gotten up in East London and talked about how the future of the UK economy would be digital, and it would scale from East London and become national. And I had a discussion at the consulate that day. We thought about, well, hey, a lot of those companies that start scaling in the UK tech ecosystem are going to eventually think about launching, scaling, looking to raise money, and potentially exiting in America. What would it look like if we focused on that and actually sort of brought the assistance to help do that to the UK, right? And so then I sort of, for a number of years, sort of traveled back and forth between the UK and the US, and then we launched the Wilson Sonsini office formally on Old Street few years ago, right? And the focus, the core focus, I think, has always been to help UK companies on that US life cycle, right? And it usually begins with more often than not, sort of one of two questions, which is, hey, I'm going to the US, what do I do next? Or I'm looking to raise money, potentially from America, what do we do next? And sort of go from there.
And so back in 2010, as somebody who had sort of been fostered in the US environment, and what was the US's take on the UK in terms of from an outsider's perspective? Did it still seem quite sort of small town relative to the Valley?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think London, at least from let's say a US standpoint, really started to, I think, grow in stature until sort of the middle of the last decade. So somewhere around 2013, 2014, 2015. Actually, I remember very vividly, showing my age now, that in the autumn of 2013, I think it was October of 2013. Could be off a month or so, that there was a front page above the fold story in the New York Times called "Technology on the Thames," and I remember that it featured a picture of Michael Acton Smith actually, and talked all about how there was this new renaissance of tech. Maybe new renaissance is the wrong word, but this sort of new tech hub that was growing in East London, and talked about the Tech City Initiative, and talked about the different companies being built there. And I think that was one thing that really started to pique the interest in particular on the U.S. side. And then you just saw more and more interesting companies start to really succeed in America. I mean, King Digital, listed in the U.S. Mimecast listed in the U.S. But I think the easiest way to explain the profile of London from a U.S. perspective is the following. In 2010, there was $100 million total invested into London technology companies. And in 2019, there was $10 billion invested into London technology companies. And, in the last Startup Genome report, London was tied for number 2 globally with New York, joint with New York, and then number 2 to Silicon Valley in terms of top startup hubs in the world. So somehow, in the last decade, we've gone from, Cameron standing near Old Street Roundabout saying that we're going to build this, to actually we've built it. It is one of the great startup hubs of the world.
Well, what is quite interesting about the timings of this was exactly the time where I joined the Angel Investment Network, or the London tech ecosystem, was in 2010. So my first job out of university was Angel Investment Network to broker deals between the angels and the startups. And it's changed unrecognisably so. I mean, there was a big thing that moved us, or moved the needle, I noticed, is when the app economy started booming, and it was almost like a barrier to entry to becoming an entrepreneur lowered, and more people got involved in it, and then it became more part of the conversation. Because before that, it was almost like entrepreneur was like a dirty word, as though going and doing that was like going and being an actor. It was to take risk. It was to sort of go do something, fail, embarrass yourself, and then go and get a real job. Whereas actually now it's just so much part of the culture, which is obviously, as you say, is starting to be reflected in the amount of money going in, which is obviously the biggest proxy to how many ideas are going to come out of our environment. So when you sort of first were knitting this relationship between the US and UK together, was it to go and source these companies in the UK, and did you have to convince them then that they wanted to go to the US, or were they biting at the bit trying to get the information?
No, and I guess I should start off by I'll recall a discussion I had the very first time I talked to my friends in the UK government about this, and the comment was brought up about moving to the US, and I remember it has always been permanently, we're not moving companies to the US, it's expanding to the US. Right. Yeah. There is a subtle but important difference there, but yeah, what we found is that I think early on, let's say when I first started, traveling to London periodically, maybe about a decade ago, we met a lot of companies that said we have to go to the U.S. because there's not enough venture capital here, and we need to. And sometimes it actually was we need to move the business to the U.S. because we need to raise a seed or a Series A round in the U.S. And I think one of the many things that has evolved in the London and broader UK tech ecosystem over the past decade or so is that we generally don't hear those conversations and we don't have those conversations anymore. Companies regularly come to us and say, I'd be interested, in raising a seed or Series A with the U.S. lead if the American investor was in turn interested. But that's a different statement than I have to move to the U.S. because there is not seed or Series A available in the UK. And frankly, the seed and Series A environment in the UK, in my opinion, is fantastic. It's a robust environment, and it's one of the things that's really fueled the growth here. Is just so many great homegrown funds that are building tremendous businesses. But in terms of, I want to go back to the question. I mean, I don't think we ever had to convince companies. We were never over here selling the U.S. It was more that if this is something that companies wanted to do, whether from a capital raising or a commercial expansion standpoint, we're here to help think through whether that makes sense first and foremost, and then number two, how to go about doing it. And I do want to stress that first point. About does it make sense? I mean, we regularly meet companies that we end up, frankly, talking out of U.S. expansion, right? I mean, let's call it the way it is. The U.S. is in general a much more expensive place to do business. The commercial upside is massive, right? The ROI, if you get it right, is massive, but the upfront investment, especially in terms of what it costs to hire people. And obviously the more complicated environment that not only are you going to another country, but you're expanding to a country that is actually subdivided into 50 different states, each with its own compliance environment with a federal overlay, right? It's not necessarily easy. It's a well-traveled path, right? But it's not necessarily simple, and it's certainly to do it right, not necessarily cheap. So a lot of the discussions that we have are pressure testing what the company's rationale is for going to the US in the first place. Okay.
And because it was really interesting what you say, because obviously that early phase does seem like it was almost being an actor needing to go to Hollywood. It was like there is only this one destination in the US. And as you're right, as more capital is available in the UK, the runway extends, more market validation can be done here, and the bigger the company can get before it moves across. What would be a typical thing that made you just flat out say, you know what, leave the US alone. You don't need it. It's not ready for you. And you'd advise somebody against that.
Yeah. So, I mean, classic example, I mean, would be, this is not a specific anecdote, it's an amalgam of anecdotes, would be, you know, a company comes to us and they've raised, like, let's say 500,000 in angel angel money, and they are not going to move to the US. They're going to keep everybody in the UK. And they say, right, we're going to open up in New York. We're going to hire our first sales lead, and go at it in New York. Well, you know, to hire a good senior salesperson in New York, right, head of sales in Manhattan, will cost you anywhere between $300,000 to $500,000 a year, fully loaded, right, with salary plus bonus and commission, benefits, all of that. Fully loaded, you're looking at $300,000 to $500,000 a year for, you know, a senior person. And junior people are going to be, you know, 2-3 times what you're going to pay them in the U.S. And then, you know, and that's the point where I would say, really, you know, you're sort of early revenue. You're building the business in the UK. You won't move to the US. You're going to outsource it to someone that you're going to pay as much money as you've raised total. It's probably not the right fit yet. Now, if they said, we're going to go hire, however, first, we, the founders, are going to move to New York and build the business there, maybe leave, you know, the tech function, right, and engineering back in the UK, but we're going to move to the US. We're going to go raise a round and then hire a team. Okay, that's fair. I mean, there's a deeper conversation to be had, which is, why are you moving to the US as opposed to building it in the UK? But in theory, if there's a good commercial justification for that at least, you know, that's doable, and we've certainly seen that work out. But I do think that there's a reality of how much it costs to launch and scale a U.S. business properly, and as a result, we usually see the most successful companies go early or go late. In other words, companies either decide early on that the U.S. is going to be their core market, and they build the business to attack the U.S. market. And they may have some functions remain in the UK, but the real, you know, the management, executives, founders end up going to the US and building it as a almost like a US business with a UK back office, which allows them to raise US capital as if they were a homegrown American business. That's go early. Go late, which is much more common, is that the company builds the business to attack the UK market, right? Scales up, raises a seed round, often raises a Series A. The Series A often ends up becoming the U.S. expansion round, right? That they raise capital in part to support what hopefully is U.S. traction. That, in other words, they start to get pulled into the U.S. by customer traction or user growth, and they raise the A or sometimes the B round, you know, in order to, you know, hire employees in the U.S. and build up a team, and, you know, and to get office space, and to basically build up a second operation in America that now looks to Americanize what they've already proven out with product market fit in the UK.
To your point about the first option of move early, there was a good article I was reading that was talking about the cost of Silicon Valley's developers. You know, you've got these amazing spin outs from Google and stuff like that, but they are so expensive, and actually the tech talent pool in the EU is quite good. So as far as a back office is concerned, building it in the EU, which, you know, let's say like for like, the technology could be almost on par, is never a bad thing to do for a UK or European based company anyway, just simply because of the arbitrage there.
Yeah, that's actually seen to being a plus to many U.S. investors who are sort of, you know, the U.S. investors who become somewhat more knowledgeable and sophisticated over the years about investing into the UK and Europe. That's part of the value that they see in investing in the UK and Europe, or investing in companies that are U.S. UK or U.S. European companies, and that they've got some functions in the U.S., but they've got those functions, as you've mentioned, that are a little bit of the arbitrage with respect to the UK or Europe. It's akin to what we're seeing even in America right now, even with homegrown American startups. You see investors now. In fairness, before I go any further, this is slightly a little bit more of a pre-COVID dynamic. I mean, in a COVID world, where people are based is obviously much more fluid and a little bit different. But you know, in a pre-COVID world, we were certainly seeing the response of some Silicon Valley investors who would say, listen, yeah, maybe management and some of the sales, et cetera, needs to be in the Valley, but do you really want to be going head to head with the biggest tech companies and best funded tech companies in the world to hire engineers when you can potentially have them sit anywhere else in the U.S. It's the same dynamic, and that look, and California is hard in that respect. And one of the things that's maybe not so obvious, when you're coming in from outside the states, is that California is one of the U.S. states where you can't enforce restrictive covenants, right? Against employees. Like as a U.S. employee, in California, you literally can walk out the door that morning and say, "I'm going to go work for your biggest competitor." Can't do anything about it other than ensuring that they abide by their NDA. About their confidentiality provisions.
Really? Is there anything you can do to, or is it so it could be the landscape of just the tech poaching to the highest bidder, I guess? And that's one of the reasons why salaries are so high in California in tech, because the talent is in high demand, and California public policy, and which is reflected in their employment law, is free movement of employees. Right. And so as a result, you really need to keep your employees happy, in order to prevent movement. Not to prevent, but discourage movement. Yeah.
Discourage.
And so when a company expands, we touched on a point earlier, which was they then set up this, let's call it an extension or an operation in the US. What kind of legal structure will they then go and chase to do this? Because we've all heard of sort of Delaware flips, LLCs, and all this stuff, and that's not my world. But I'd love to sort of get a framework for understanding what people should then look at doing and what the pros and cons might be of each decision.
Sure. Yeah. If it's helpful, I'm happy to kind of lay out the kind of straw man, which is what we most often see, by far what we most often see when a UK limited company looks to hire in the US. So I'll set up the sort of background. I think the most common setup that companies are looking to create in the U.S. would involve, let's say, hiring one or two employees to start. I'm going to call it New York, right? So let's say that you've got a single UK limited company who says, right, I'm going to go hire 2 New York employees. What do I do next? Okay. So what you end up doing is, from a legal standpoint, and I'll go on to some of the other non-legal areas in a minute, is you end up creating a Delaware C Corp subsidiary more often than not, and I'll break down why. Okay, so Delaware is the most common state of incorporation in the U.S. The entire U.S. venture capital economy is built on investing into Delaware C corporations. A very high percentage of companies that are publicly traded in the United States are Delaware corporations. Long ago, Delaware set itself up as the go-to state for incorporation. It has a robust set of corporate laws that are predictable and very, very, very good. It's got a highly experienced corporate court system. It's just the easy, frictionless place to set up a company in the U.S. Right. The next bit, which is a corporation, there are sort of the two most common types of company to set up in the U.S. from a structure standpoint are a corporation or a limited liability company, which is an LLC, as you mentioned earlier. We see most companies who are UK limited parent companies set up with a corporation, largely for tax reasons. A corporation is a tax opaque entity. In other words, it's taxed itself for its activities, whereas an LLC is the owners of the LLC are taxed for their activities. And now I'm not a U.S. tax advisor, but I understand from my U.S. tax advisor friends that it does create certain UK tax complexities to have a UK parent company over an LLC, a tax pass-through entity, and that it just ends up being cleaner to have a corporation, right? And then finally, why a subsidiary and not a topco? In other words, the so-called Delaware flip. The advice that we often give on that, the guidance maybe we often give on that is sort of it can be reduced to a tweet, which is the decision to create a U.S. subsidiary is generally commercially and operational driven. the decision to create a U.S. parent company is typically investor-driven.
Gotcha.
In other words, you can largely do whatever you want to in the U.S. with very limited exceptions through a U.S. subsidiary, right? You can hire people, hire employees, hire contractors, enter into contracts, get visas, et cetera. You can do all that through a U.S. subsidiary. However, from a parent company standpoint, there are some U.S. investors, fewer than there used to be, but there's still plenty, who simply either cannot invest in anything other than a Delaware C corporation. In other words, their fund documents say that they have to invest in Delaware corporations, or simply from a friction standpoint don't want to invest in anything other than a Delaware corporation, right? And in fact may say to companies, and we see this all the time, we are willing to give you a term sheet, or in fact we have given you a term sheet. However, we're going to condition it on you flipping into a Delaware parent company between signing of the term sheet and closing of the financing, so that you end up running two parallel transactions, right? After you sign the term sheet, you do the Delaware flip transaction. In other words, you create a Delaware corporation. You do a share-for-share exchange with that Delaware corporation, so that at the end, the cap table of your UK company is now the cap table of the Delaware parent company, and the UK limited company is now a wholly owned subsidiary of your new Delaware parent company. Right. And then once that's completed, the U.S. investment comes into the Delaware company.
I was going to say, in terms of transfer of assets between the two, whether it be IP or anything like that, is there any difference between the topco being UK, US based in terms of they'll pass it all over to the US?
No, actually, usually you wouldn't. No. Usually you would keep the assets where they are. It's a share for share exchange. It's not necessarily an asset transfer, or at least unless in maybe exceptional cases there might be tax reasons to do it that way. But generally speaking, it would not be an asset transfer. It'd just be a share for share exchange.
And from your base of expansion, so once you're set up in Delaware, what will a company do when it needs to start trading across different states? And is there any advantage to, where, if it's got to start employing people in different states of how it'll start to regulate itself and grow and form?
Yeah. So we'll step back for a second. So now we've created a Delaware C Corp subsidiary. And now you want to hire, let's say, actually we'll make it a little more complicated than we indicated previously. We'll have an employee in New York and an employee in California. Right, and now we are set up with a Delaware corporation. What do we do next? Well, you're going to give New York state employment documents to your New York employee, and California state employee documents to your California employee. And those documents, more often than not, end up being an IP assignment and confidentiality agreement and an offer letter. The former doing exactly what it says on the tin, IP assignment confidentiality agreement, and the latter being sort of where you have the financials and economics of the arrangement. The U.S. is at will employment, and it doesn't have the sort of long form formal employment contracts in quite the same way that the UK does. But what you would do, right, is that you would give the California documents to California employee, New York documents to New York employee, and just to confirm each of the 50 states, you want to have state-specific employment documents, each governed by, because employment law in the U.S. is state rather than federal for the most part. But then you will register to do business in each state where you have employees or offices, right? Each state's rules are slightly different, but that's the rule of thumb. If you have an employee or an office in the state, you need to register to do business with the Secretary of State's office. So you would start off by registering your company as a foreign Delaware corporation, not as a foreign UK company, but a foreign Delaware corporation, foreign to the state of New York, registering in the state of New York, and then registering as a foreign Delaware corporation in the state of California as well. And each time that you hire individuals in different states, you would then you would do the same thing. You would register with the Secretary of State's office as a Delaware corporation doing business there, and you would provide your employees with the relevant state-specific employment documents. Now that's different, by the way, than what you need to do from a tax standpoint, which is when you're selling into different states, you need to be thinking about working with your tax advisor in the U.S. to register for sales tax. But that's different than what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, now you see how the complexity of the 50 different components starts to grow and grow and grow and grow. Another thing that I've read about is also this idea that of the trademarking and protecting what's yours is really important to people going to the US, because simply put, you can be challenged on it quite easily. And what I read was that you don't have to pay the loser doesn't have to pay the winner's legal fees, so you actually have the right to challenge. I might be praising it, but is that roughly?
No. You have unlocked one of the great secrets about doing business in America. Is actually what you just said about legal fees. Is it makes the doing business in the U.S. meaningfully different than in other parts of the world, including the UK. And this applies to trademarks, but it applies to lots of other things as well. And here's the issue, right? I'll bring it back to trademarks in a minute, which is that in the UK, if you and I have a business dispute, right, and we go to court and you win, I pay most or all of your fees, right? And that creates a real disincentive for us to go to court unless one of us is like 100% certain, right, that we're going to win. Otherwise, we're kind of going double or nothing there. And as a result, there's much less. Not only are you less likely to go to court, but that means that you're less likely to be sending threatening letters to each other saying, "If you don't do what I say, I'll see you in court." Because is that really credible, right? And so as a result, from that, you end up seeing fewer business disputes turn into potential and actual court cases, and actually business people end up working out business disputes among themselves to a large extent, right? And now compare that to the U.S. And if you and I have a business dispute in the U.S. and we go to court and you win, you still pay your own fees,
right?
And if I'm bigger than you are, if I have a bigger company than you are, and I'm better capitalized than you are, I can put you in a position where I threaten you with a claim, right? And say, right, okay, now you can go to court, win, and now you're out hundreds of thousands, $1 million in legal fees, or you can settle on my terms, right? And so as a result, in the U.S., this is why doing business in the U.S., number one, is much more advisory focused. That you have your law firm, your tax firm, your bank, your insurance provider, your HR provider around you as a team that sort of keeps you safe from this stuff, right? But also why you end up taking advice in the U.S. on a much more proactive problem avoidance basis than you do in the UK.
Interesting,
right? It's a little bit. I sometimes liken it to let's say plumbing, right? Which is that, if you have a leak in the UK, and you can't fix it yourself, then you might call a plumber, right, to fix the leak. In the US, by the time you discover the leak, it may be too late and your house is already flooded. You need to prevent the leak in the first place.
Gotcha.
Right. That's a very different way of doing business. And to bring it back to trademarks, what can happen is that if you go into the U.S. and you're using a brand, right, that is similar to, let's say, one owned by a bigger company who's in arguably a similar space than you are, then they can threaten you with an infringement claim, right, and send you a nasty letter and say, hey, we see that you're doing business in the U.S. and you're using our brand or using this brand, and here's our registered brand, and we think that you are confusingly similar, and you better stop, or you're going to hear further from us. And what they're doing is they're threatening a lawsuit. And regardless, in that respect, even if you think you have the better case, are you going to fight it out against a Fortune 500 company when you don't get your legal fees reimbursed if you win?
Does this also make the claims bigger because you have to reimburse your fees, so therefore the claims you'll make may be even larger to cover the cost of that, and then also get what you feel like you're justly deserving of? What, in the US or the UK? Yeah, because you see... No. In the US, what happens is, in the trademark context and other contexts, it's just simply the threat itself puts the startup in a position where they have to make a very difficult choice. Actually, it's not that difficult, right? Are they really going to go and defend litigation in the U.S. against a big company, even if they win, right? Because regardless if they win and they don't have to pay anything to the other side, they still have to pay the cost of their own cost of litigation,
right? And the other side will make their life probably pretty expensive. Or the company could just say, is this trademark really worth it to us? We're just going to rebrand.
Yeah, you kind of get the cult of what I call celebrity law firm almost in America, where you hear these names which get wheeled out, and as you say, nobody's going to take them on because they're so well staffed, capitalized, and they are incredibly skilled at making the problems go away. Does this maintain a similar relationship for employment law in terms of your employees in America? If they judge that you mistreat them, they can do the same thing.
It's exactly right. This is actually the most common dispute that we found, at least, I think, for UK companies going to the US tend to be employment disputes.
Wow.
Right? Because on the one hand, right, the US is at-will employment. Right. Which is, you can technically, for the most part, walk into the office and say to someone, I'm sorry, but this is your last day and you're going to have to clean out your desk, and give no reason, and they have to leave, and that's it. No notice, no severance, no nothing. That's it. Right. On the other hand, there are the U.S. has a robust set of anti-discrimination rules, that cover a whole range of different scenarios, right? And remember, it's not loser pays in litigation. So, what can happen is, an aggrieved employee can go to a contingency fee employment law firm. Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, a firm that won't charge a fee unless the individual recovers something, right? Whether through settlement or through litigation with the employer, and they lay out their scenario, their case to the employment law firm, who says, right, we're going to write a nasty letter to your employer and say that you've been discriminated against or you were wrongfully terminated for the following reasons. And then they get that letter, and now what do? Right? You are now in a business dispute with someone who has a free lawyer.
Is that federal level of regulation, or is that state, the discrimination laws? Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, the way around this, right? Again, in both instances with trademark and employment, is to work proactively, right? So on the employment side, what we typically see is that the companies will have a much different discussion than just, I'm sorry, you're going to have to leave today. It's going to be, let's think about what the right outcome is. Is it providing some sort of severance, pay, some sort of arrangement for them to cushion the blow, in exchange from a release of all claims against the company, right? In other words, mutually agreeing to leave on good terms. Right. There's nothing that legally requires that, but it just tends to be good business practice a lot of the time in the U.S. to avoid those sorts of scenarios that I just described earlier. But again, you wouldn't do that unless you're sort of proactively thinking, right, what do I need to do before termination? What I need to do is think through, okay, am I going to provide severance? If so, how much? Do we need a release of all claims here, et cetera, as opposed to just going out and terminating and then trying to figure it out afterwards. And on the trademark side, the way to avoid getting bullied by big companies like that is to think through, okay, do you do a trademark search before you go into the U.S. market, and not only identify companies that potentially could be a true legal block, but ones that are a practical block. Right? That if your brand is similar to some other big company's brand, maybe you want to do a little bit of research. Do they act like trademark bullies? What else is out there that is similar already? In other words, maybe it's not likely that they're going to push you out of the market. But is it worth you maybe not going into certain areas of business to stay away from the larger company? Is it worth you not getting a registration because that'll sort of poke at them a little bit, as opposed to just using the brand without a registration, which you're totally allowed to do in the United States, assuming it's not infringing, right? There are strategic steps that you can take to avoid poking the bear and ending up in that position in the first place.
Because it seems a lot of this seems like almost like a game of poker. Like it's knowing the intentions of the other and guessing it. I mean, the whole wheels of the US feel more lubricated to entrepreneurship. There's a lot more money in your back pocket. Go get them. If somebody comes and tries to take what's yours, you fend it off, kind of thing. But it's all geared up to, to maximising returns and achievements and all this stuff, which sometimes the UK can feel a little bit hamstrung in the same sense. Or even the mentality of the UK is a little bit more conservative and stuff like this. But it's really interesting to see that it is this sort of, I can see why you'd want advisors the whole time, because you're having to second guess people who, these middlemen, actually have seen these situations play out a lot more than you are, and therefore can save you a lot of money.
It's why the advice that you need from your advisors in the U.S., not just legal, but all your advisors, tends to be a blend of the technical and the commercial, right? In the U.S., there are, I don't want to scare people off, but there are a lot of risks there, okay? But there's a lot of upside. There's a ton of upside, right? So the question is always, how do I appropriately manage risk while maximizing my potential upside, right? How do I achieve my commercial goals while managing risk? And given that that's the environment, that leads to a very, I think, unique, not uniquely American, but distinctively American approach to being an advisor to companies, which is to think through not only here are the risks, you need to avoid them, it is here are the risks, and here's how we manage around them to get you to where we need you to be. And here's how we've seen several hundred other companies in similar positions as you do it in the past. Is it risk-free? No. Is it worth the risk for the potential upside? Yes. And that's the thought process, right? Is sort of thinking along with the entrepreneur, knowing how he or she, what they're ultimately focused on, which is mission, and the biggest business, most successful business possible, right? And marrying that up with, how do you help them avoid those pitfalls and getting them to where they want to be in the end, right? Not saying, here are your risks, figure out what you want to do. It's got to be, here are the risks, here are other companies have dealt with it. Here would be our advice, but we're happy to talk you through why this may or may not be the best for you in this context.
I'm guessing within all of this as well that relationships are important, and that actually took me on to another kind of line of questioning I was going to go with, which is if somebody from the UK goes and takes US venture capital, I imagine the US VC has a distinctive view on how it wants you to approach expansion as well, which means that they'll be sort of either with you and helping propel you along, or lobbying you to do something that might be putting you between a rock and a hard place. I assume that they will be trying to do what's best for you, but what are the relationships like with UK companies to US VC? I guess starting with how do they attract them, and then the kind of relationship that unfolds subsequently.
So how to attract US investment? I do think that there's a little bit of a pre-COVID and post-COVID story there that I think I need to sort of break down. Pre-COVID, generally speaking, what we would find is that the stronger the U.S. story, certainly at seed and Series A, the more likely it would be that an American VC would lead around. We actually did a research project with Bowhurst, the UK tech data provider, earlier this year. And found, and we published this. This is available on Medium if anyone's interested in taking a look. That there were roughly in 2018 and 2019, there were roughly 2,800 seed and Series A rounds raised by British startups. And what we wanted to know is, of those 2,800, how many were led by American-only VC funds into UK-only companies. In other words, U.S. fund, not angels, right, but traditional U.S. funds, right, who do not have UK or European operations, leading seed or Series A into UK-only companies who haven't set up in the U.S. The number out of 2,800 was 52, right? And a number of those 52 were repeat founders who had, let's say, worked with the funds on a prior occasion. Right. But, 52 out of 2,800 rounds is not a huge likelihood. And later stage, it's a little bit different, B and beyond. But actually at B and beyond is when the company more often than not is set up US. But the earlier stage the company is, in our experience, the stronger the US story has to be, right? In other words, does it have a team on the ground? What team does it have on the ground, right? In the US, is it the founder? Is it a junior salesperson? Is it a US general manager? What does that team look like? What are the revenues coming out of the US? What are the traction? What's the traction? Does it have product market fit? Who are its US reference customers if it's B2B, right? If you're really set on raising, a seed or an A, and sometimes a B, but definitely I think a seed or an A in the U.S. At least historically, the question has got to be why does it make more sense to raise from an American investor? How are they going to provide more value here, given the stage of the business, than raising from the robust seed and A VC ecosystem here in the UK? And the answer to that generally is got to be something along the lines of, hey, either you are in a very specific space as a VC, the VC is in a very specific space that doesn't, let's say, exist in the UK, or more often that the company's already built a strong US story and US investment would make sense at that stage. When you get to later stage investment, B and beyond, then you're talking about growth capital, where it's a little bit easier to invest remotely solely based on metrics. I mean, you're investing into a growth story, right, as opposed to a little bit more of a risk venture story at seed and Series A. Now, post-COVID, I think that there's a little bit of an addendum there, which is we are, and I don't want to oversell this, right, but I think anecdotally we are seeing it slightly easier for companies to get meetings now with U.S. funds, because everybody's investing remotely. I mean, there was a comment that a Silicon Valley VC made to me earlier this year. It said, "Listen, we're investing remotely into San Francisco companies at this point, right? Because people aren't meeting. So, it is a little bit easier now to get comfortable investing, or at least getting to know a company that's in the UK or Europe. Now, on the other hand, keep in mind that if you're the UK company here, you are now competing in a way that you never were with companies globally. Yeah. That no longer do they necessarily have to go do the Silicon Valley Roadshow or the New York Roadshow in order to attract the attention of investors. They just maybe need the warm introduction, and then the time to set up the Zoom or the Teams or the video meeting. That's a very different dynamic, right? But I think I guess what I would conclude on that point by saying is, if you are a great company outside the U.S. that where it would make sense to connect with and maybe raise money from U.S. investors, it is probably easier than ever before to get to those investors. Because you can do those calls now remotely, as opposed to showing up in the Valley or in New York, et cetera.
Would they be expecting quite different deal terms from a US VC than they might otherwise get from European and UK venture firms, or is it all pretty similar now?
I mean, there's a lot of similarities. I mean, there's a couple things I'll throw out there that might be different. I mean, you will, I think, on average, see a larger option pool requested in the US. It wouldn't be uncommon, for example, to have like a 20% option pool, let's say at A or B, because the goal, right? I mean, in the U.S., there's a much longer, older story of employees, being successfully incentivized, right, through options, and going through successful tech companies, starting early on and having a really good outcome on the exit, and so that's something that I think because of that history motivates and incentivizes employees perhaps a little bit more in the U.S. than it does in the UK. And certainly, investors for the most part are on board with that in the U.S. and want the company to devote a sufficiently sizable percentage of its cap table to to an option pool, because it wants to see everybody rowing in the same direction, right? That they want everybody in the company focused on creating wealth and mission, right? Building the most successful business possible, however you define success. In the UK and Europe, there isn't that lengthy tradition of yet of employees having those really successful outcomes on employee equity, and certainly things I think are changing. In the last decade, it's much more common to see employee equity than it was it was a decade ago. But you still don't see on average the option pools as large in the UK, because they don't just simply have to be.
Well, we don't play the valuation game quite as well as the US as well, which also makes your equity piece more exciting. I mean, if you get into a growth story in the US and you have a company that goes from $5 million to $500 million, it's better than, when you get in here and you get a company where it might be worth 2.5, and then it sort of goes up to 15, 20, 25, and then he has to do the US expansion piece to become the 100, 200, 500 million pound company. It's harder to see immediately how that little equity piece, when you're negotiating up front, is as beneficial as the salary piece. And ideally, we should have both. And I think US employees, as you say, are just better versed in discussing these topics and how to negotiate them. It's almost like a second language for them, whereas here it's still a bit of an unknown, or people still scratching their heads about.
Well, the U.S. has been doing, the Valley especially, the Valley's been doing this for 60 years, right? I mean, you're talking about multiple generations of companies with employees exiting, or employees who make money on the exit from their options, who then found their own companies, or who become VCs, and then the cycle repeats over and over. It's the flywheel effect, right? And that builds into the fabric of the ecosystem certain approaches to building a business, and employee equity is one of them. In the UK, if you go back to, I always say this is my favorite statistic, right? Is that $100 million total into London tech companies in 2010. That's basically a standing start. Up till now, 10 billion last year. 10 years is not that long of a time in terms of the very beginning of a tech ecosystem. And by the way, my apologies to companies, and there are plenty of great companies that were built before 2010. I'm not trying to suggest that there wasn't tech ecosystem there before 2010, but I do think that given the venture numbers that year, and given the launch of the Tech City initiative that year, that's sort of a good, I think, starting point to sort of show how the perception of entrepreneurship and venture capital and scaling companies has changed in the UK. As you said at the outset, right? The thought of entrepreneurship being much more acceptable now in some quarters than it had been. And I think that really started to change right around that 2010 time. But the average time to IPO in the US is like 10 or 11 years.
Yeah.
Well, that's almost exactly how long the UK ecosystem from that 2010 break point that I mentioned has been around. There are plenty of unicorns now. We are going to start seeing the exits, right? And then the flywheel effect is really going to kick in. It's already started to kick in a little bit. We certainly see multiple, repeat founders now. But once you start to see the great exits come from these unicorns, and you do see the employees who had equity presumably, hopefully make out pretty well, and then become, new startup founders and new VCs, that's when things really take off, right? And by the way, that's why we need to get the exits right on this generation. This is in my opinion, this is the moment of truth for the UK tech ecosystem over the next several years. It's one thing to raise $10 billion. It's another thing to 5-10x that $10 billion through liquidity events.
Yeah, we were discussing this, weren't we, when saying that the match day is upon us, and there is no more waiting. We've got about 5 years whereby these things need to go through. I took heart, actually. One of my clients, who I think called Super Awesome, recently got a good exit to Epic Games. So it was like, that's good. And Dylan seems to have exited a few times now, so he's definitely on his way to being a serial entrepreneur, and people like that. So these things are coming. I mean, the next crop is going to be our fintech unicorns, and see what becomes of them, because we've been talking about how great the UK fintech scene is, and I think we've really sort of said we're the best in the world. We do finance really well, and that's where I see us as needing some real exits. And I know there's been a few wobbles this year, and we'll see how those all pan out with this sort of big three, Revolut, Monzo and Starling, but it's going to be interesting.
But you're going to have you're going to have employees, right, come out of those companies, and I mean, you already do sometimes, but after the exits, right, you're going to see employees go and do all sorts of incredible things, and take the money that they've earned and the experience that they've earned and invest that back into the UK tech ecosystem, and that's where you'll really see the scaling happen.
Because it's interesting, I guess. I can't see a way anybody truly catches up to Silicon Valley. I mean, short of something completely unpredictable happening, which 2020 seems to be full of these kind of events, but it's head and shoulders above the rest. I mean, I saw an amazing statistic the other day, which was in Q3 of 2020. The US did something like $36 or $37 billion worth of investments, which was as much as the whole of the European Union in 2019. So it's like the scale is still just unprecedented, and I guess you're getting New York as a satellite to Silicon Valley, which is probably getting known for its own sort of special ecosystem. And I think one of the questions I was going to have was, is there a world in which London almost becomes the 51st state because we build these bridges so well?
Man, there are so many loaded statements there. I mean, as a New Yorker, a former New Yorker, calling New York a satellite.
Clearly, financially speaking, it's an absolute juggernaut. I mean, literally in the startup context, because I know.
Yeah. And if you think I'm gonna touch London being the 51st state of America, I'm not going anywhere near that. But no, I do think though that. You don't need tech ecosystems do not need to compare themselves necessarily to Silicon Valley, or at least not in the respect of, are we going to catch up to and somehow overtake Silicon Valley? That's not really the point, right? The point is simply, can we create and scale and exit and then do it all over again, over and over and over, world-beating businesses. Right, Silicon Valley can build world-beating businesses, and that doesn't stop New York and London from building world-beating businesses, right? I mean, it's my own view that this is all collaborative, not competitive. And in some respects, I feel like the initial promise of the Tech City speech 10 years ago is, I'm not going to say fulfilled, but it's certainly on the way, which is we have scaled the digital economy in the UK. And I remember another line in the speech was, can we become a peer, or words to that effect, of Silicon Valley? And I think that we have, right? I mean, you can't have $10 billion, invested into an ecosystem here in London and have it be deemed not to be a world-beating ecosystem, right? It may be new, right? But it can go toe to toe with anybody now.
I think what's an interesting validation point that we found at at the angel level was, on hearing the Brexit news maybe 4 years ago, we chose to expand UK offerings out to different territories, and we've been getting investments or investors interested from Singapore, Switzerland, even Australia, interested in UK startups, and that to us has been a real turning point, because there is this sort of, we're talking about, as I say, with kind of COVID, there's sort of this global ecosystem where everybody's part of the conversation now. So sort of pulling in funds from overseas is a sort of validation that you really are doing something worthwhile. You're not caught in your own echo chamber, sort of just self-fertilizing, tilling your own soil. It's like actually people from around the world are saying, I could choose anywhere in the world and we're going to back this company, which is kind of exciting, I think.
Yeah, no, and we certainly see it, and especially in certain sectors. I mean, the halo effect around UK fintech is fantastic to see, right? I mean, AI is recognized, I think, globally, and digital health. There's a lot of different areas now that, the UK broadly speaking is really sort of firing on all cylinders, where it's combining the great talent and the great knowledge that there is here, and marrying it with commercial savvy and investment. The one thing I'll say though is that I don't know that you necessarily need to take in U.S. investment. Let me reframe what I was about to say. U.S. investment is not the right answer for every company, right? And you really need to marry up, the investment hypothesis of the investors that you bring in, especially the ones that are going to be on your board, right? And what you as a founder, you as a management team want to achieve with this company, right? Because raising capital is not the end itself; it's a means to an end. and you need to make sure that the end that the investor is looking for is the same as the end that you're looking for. And sometimes it's not, right? I mean, sometimes that the, especially with some of the value funds who are looking for every company to return the fund, right? And really need to see a pathway to be a $3-5 billion exit. And if you as a founder are like, you know what, I got to tell you, at 250, I'd be thrilled, and then I'm out. That may not be the right investor for you because, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's no moral judgment there. It's just simply you've got an investor who needs the company to be this, and you're actually perfectly satisfied with the company being that. Well, okay. I mean, and maybe you still bring that investor in, but that also suggests that maybe, you might exit the business before the business exits, right? That you might not be the right person to meet the expectations of the VC. And so one of the things that we counsel companies all the time on is that, you really need as a company to do diligence on your investor, the same way that your investor is going to do diligence on you. And I don't mean diligence to make sure that they're on the up and up or anything. I just mean diligence that you understand what do they really expect from their portfolio companies, and is that consistent with what you want out of your business?
I mean, we have a very different investment culture here in the UK in that our VCs are very heavily weighted towards being ex-financial services professionals as opposed to the same density of previous entrepreneurs, which does slightly colour the culture. And equally, we can't have the same sort of, it needs to be $100 billion exit because we simply don't have any. So the fund can't claim to need to have, let's say, a 10 billion plus company because it's just, we don't have the proof or the data or the track record. But it is interesting. I wonder if our culture will, as you say, through another life cycle or two, will change to our VCs will become much more previously exited entrepreneurs, employees of big companies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. No, I mean, time will tell how the venture ecosystem changes here. I actually do think that that's right. I think that you'll, once you see, a run of high quality exits, I think it'll be probably a little bit easier, to build slightly different types of funds. Let me be clear. There are definitely some funds in the UK and Europe that are running what we would think of as more traditional American style, investment hypotheses. But you're going to see more of them, I think. The more quality exits that we get. But what I'm really encouraged by though is that, I mean, that in my opinion at least, that the UK has gotten to the point where gotten to a place where it's a pretty well functioning venture ecosystem. I mean, there's a robust seed ecosystem. There's a robust angel ecosystem. A robust Series A ecosystem. There might not be as much B and C and beyond, as I think there will be eventually. I do think that that's the biggest opportunity to scale in the UK and Europe is more B and beyond funds. But actually, B and beyond is where the American funds are historically at least have been much more ready and willing to come in and lead, even with a slightly weaker U.S. story, because growth stories are a little bit easier to invest into than sort of pre-growth risk stories. But what that means is that from a company standpoint, is that if you're a company building from scratch in the UK now, if you're a great company, there is a fully functioning venture ecosystem, largely, starting with the UK only, but eventually becoming properly transatlantic to support whatever it is that you need to do, right? You literally, and I don't think this was true 10 years ago, that if you are a great company, there is no reason why you cannot build, scale, and successfully exit that company from a UK base.
Yeah, well, it actually takes me to a little plug for you, which is your involvement in a piece of work in conjunction with Index Ventures recently, which was called Destination USA. Am I right? And I'll let you give like a brief overview of that. We don't need to go into it too much, but that was sort of channeling that playbook depending on what kind of company you were and how you might like to expand a sort of formulaic fashion.
Yeah, no, the folks at Index put together just a fantastic report. It actually came out in a hardcover book, and then it's online as well. Called Destination USA, and it's the result of hundreds of interviews that they did with experienced founders. I mean, both companies, individuals who had exited and those who were still building their businesses, and they had identified sort of a finite number of approach, I think it was 4 specific types of models for successful U.S. expansion, and then and backed it up with just dozens and dozens of examples of real world scenarios of how companies did and did not succeed by using these models, and what types of companies coming out of the UK and Europe are best suited for those models. And and we had helped them a bit on that, and we're very grateful to have had the opportunity to collaborate with them on that.
Well, it makes me wonder, once we have, I'm not going to take up too much of your time, I realize you've been exceptionally generous so far, but it makes me wonder if, as people start to figure out the sort of the train tracks of moving forward, because it becomes less about guesswork and more about planning, and with what they've done, it is an exceptional piece of work, and they really have made a really interesting case for sort of, you may fall either side of what they're sort of predicting, but loosely it's a great strategy document. And it makes me wonder, do you think there's anything that the UK could still do in terms of legally or other, in terms of incentivizing our startup ecosystem, that you think we're still not doing? Do we raise the SEIS amounts? Are there any things that you think are still missing pieces of our ecosystem that we could use to incentivize it to become even better?
I do think, one thing that is missing here, and it actually goes to something that we just said a few minutes ago, and I think this is going to get cured or filled relatively soon, is that there aren't that many people in the ecosystem yet who have built the unicorn, exited the unicorn, come back. Let's say they exited in the US, come back and are building again or advising others on how to do it right. And that just goes to how relative to Silicon Valley, that relatively nascent that the ecosystem is, right? Every day we keep adding, more and more experienced people to this ecosystem, but that is something that I think a few years from now you're going to see a real difference, right? That there's going to be more and more people who have had the big exit and started from scratch and can tell the entirety of what they learned along the way, right? How did you use your investors and your board? How did you use your advisors, right? What should we do differently that maybe you made a mistake on? The more people that can speak to that with credibility, the faster that everybody is going to be able to move, and the faster and more effectively that everyone's going to be able to move leads to more valuable and successful businesses.
Yeah, I think that's pretty sensible. My last thing I'd say actually is for something to be beneficial to you is, if somebody's listening to this, what kind of person should be reaching out to Dan Glazer to go and ask for your advice? Anybody who's listening, who should be reaching out to you if they are having inklings of US expansion? I mean, what stage and what kind of companies are all welcome?
Yeah, we're stage agnostic, right? Our classic story is that we incorporated Google many years ago, and we still work closely with them, right? So within that, there's a broad array of stages that would work well. But no, usually the companies that we meet and then work with in the UK and Europe, as I said sort of at the outset, come to us with one of two questions. I'm thinking about going to the US. What do I do? And that usually means hiring people on the ground, entering into U.S. contracts, one way or the other, accessing the U.S. commercial market. Or they come to us and say, I'm looking to raise a round of capital. Right? I'm either looking to raise a round of capital to expand to the U.S., or I'm looking to raise a round of capital in the U.S. Those are the two most common inflection points, and then we go from there and hopefully work together for a decade and then have a successful IPO together. So
people shouldn't be afraid to reach out to you in fear that they're too early or anything like that. They should just get involved in.
No, it's the whole reason we're here. Literally, why I came to the UK for many years, right, is to meet companies here rather than having them try to figure out, in the US, who should they be talking to. Well, we sort of think of it as that we've tried to create augmented reality Silicon Valley, as one of my partners once said, here in London. I guess I should highlight that, always happy to have a chat, and don't worry, you're not going to receive a bill in the return post. Right? It's there has to be an open door policy, and, we are always happy to have a chat and talk about what might make sense in terms of fundraising or U.S. expansion.
Dan, well, thank you so much for your time. You're an encyclopedia of knowledge on the topic, and I'm sure there's many, many more questions that people need to ask you. So I will drop information for people in the relevant links below this video. But thank you so much for your time, and I really, really appreciate it, and for everything you're doing for the UK startup ecosystem as well.
No, you got it. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Dan.